Hi, everyone. On behalf of HR.com, welcome to the webcast, Unlock Your Hiring Potential, the predictive power of structured interviews, sponsored by Criteria. This webcast has been pre-approved for one HRCI business credit and one SHRM credit, so please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. For those of you in attendance here with us in Zoom webinar today, the credits will appear in your HR.com account within 2 business days. You'll receive an email from HR.com, which will include your certification information. During the webcast, if you have any questions for the presenters, we ask that you use the Q&A in your webinar controls, and the chat is also open for engagement. For those of you viewing this via live stream on any of our social channels, we welcome you as well, and we invite you to view the archive of this webcast on HR.com if you are looking to acquire the HRCI and SHRM credits as well. All right, now a bit about today's sponsor, Criteria. Criteria is a talent success company that helps organizations make evidence-based talent decisions that both reduce bias and drive outcomes. With a comprehensive suite of rigorous, validated assessments and video interviewing tools, Criteria helps employers highlight the potential in every job candidate. And a bit about today's presenters. First off, Dr. Matthew Neale. Actually, first we'll be starting, with Dr. Justin Ienuso. He is a senior consulting psychologist at Criteria. He holds a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology, and he has a background with managing an academic department at a university, teaching undergraduate courses in IO psychology, research, and ethics. His unique perspective on employee selection is informed by the latest academic research as well as his past experience as a hiring manager. And then next we'll have, he'll be joined by Dr. Matthew Neale, the VP of Assessment Products at Criteria. He leads the design and development of innovative assessment and video interviewing tools that provide organizations with genuine insight into their talent. Matt is a regular speaker on topics in IO psychology, technology, and HR, and he has published on these topics in peer-reviewed academic journals, including the International Journal of Selection and Assessment and the Journal of Business and Psychology. So we're definitely in for a treat, and it is now my pleasure to turn it over to you, Dr. Justin Ienuso.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here. This is a topic that Matt and I are very excited about. We're happy to present on this today, and hopefully we get some great information out there into the world. So the first item we wanted to discuss, and kind of the theme of the entire day, is what exactly do we mean by structured interviewing? Surely it's a term you've heard once or twice, or a few thousand times recently. So we thought it'd be helpful to spend a few minutes just breaking down the components. Starting with this. In an interviewing setting, what is structure? What do we mean by that? Well, we do like words in IO psychology, but we all got together and this was the shortest possible sentence we could find to describe it. And I'll read the definition here that we like to describe structure. It's any enhancement of the interview that's intended to increase psychometric properties by increasing standardization or otherwise assisting the interviewer in determining what questions to ask or how to evaluate responses. So what does that mean? Hopefully, you can see from the definition that structure can apply to both the content and the evaluation of an interview. And we will happily get into each of those separately throughout our talk today. So let's start looking at kind of the concrete elements that make up a good structured interview. One of the most important considerations is for all job candidates to experience the interview in the same way. Typically, this means all candidates are asked the same questions in the same order by the same interviewer or interviewers. We prefer multiple, and we'll explain why later. But equally important is that evaluations are completed using an objective, standardized rating scale. And we'll chat in a few minutes about what a good behaviorally anchored rating scale looks like. And don't worry, it's not too scary. We can do it. So why does this even matter? Why are we talking about this? Why are we spending an hour of our time today learning about structured interviewing? Well, based on some of the key elements that we went over and that we'll dive into with plenty of detail as we go, this is kind of the result that we should expect from a structured interviewing process. Matt's going to spend some time in a little bit getting into the psychological mechanisms that explain why this is the case. But for now, suffice it to say, structured interviews are aimed at dually increasing predictive validity while decreasing various forms of bias. So the goal being that we are getting absolutely the most possible out of what can be a very time-consuming process. And I'm sure you all have experience with that. But the goal is better quality of hires. So putting in the time and the effort to build out this structured interviewing process, as we'll give some advice on how to do throughout the day, has those aims of being more predictive, of being less biased toward various demographic subgroups, with the outcome being that we're leveraging this process in a way that gets us the best possible quality of hire, that it's a fair experience for candidates, for all candidates, and that it is justifiable in being correlated with actual on-the-job performance. So we're going through all this trouble of doing an interview. Let's make sure we can actually get some useful information out of it that can predict future success on the job. Great. So let's start to break down some of these elements individually. And I think we'll start with question design. So in a structured interview, it's a good idea to include both situational and past behavior questions. So what does that mean? Situational questions are hypothetical in nature. So, the what would you do if XYZ kind of questions, while past behavior questions refer specifically to instances where a candidate would have had to exhibit whatever our targeted competency is for that question. So these usually start with, tell me about a time XYZ. In a perfect world, questions will also be based on a job analysis, understanding that adds an extra layer of time and effort. But in doing that, it kind of unearths what successful performance looks like on the job. What do the job-related behaviors look like that we're trying to measure? And how can we target a question toward that? So always a good idea to at least have some idea of what success looks like when we're crafting our questions. And this last point is critical, and this is going to be one of our themes of the day. Questions should really only cover material that's relevant to the job. We've seen some very creative and very bad questions at times. I actually have a real whopper of one that I'll share in a few minutes, but there's all kinds of questions you can ask that are fun and creative and make for a great social experience that really don't tell us anything at all about what kind of candidate we're going to be working with. Examples are always helpful for me. So here's a couple of actual questions you might use as part of a structured interview. In this case, let's pretend we're recruiting for a customer-facing position, and we want to know how candidates handle a difficult customer interaction. So we have a couple sample questions here we can use. Sample of a situational question could be, what would you do if an angry and dissatisfied customer confronted you and there was not an easy solution that would satisfy them? So we're asking them to think through, in this scenario, how would they act? A past behavior question for the same type of competency we're targeting could say, describe a difficult time you've had dealing with an employee or customer. Why was it difficult? How did you handle it? And what was the outcome? So you see, with the situational question, there's an opportunity for the candidate to think through what they would do, even if they haven't been exposed to that situation in the past. And with the past behavior question, we're designing it to really try to get as much information as possible. So tell us what was difficult, how you handled it, and importantly, what was the result? Here's a couple more good questions. Note the happy face. For a sales-related past behavior question, maybe we're targeting persistence in a sales setting. So we can say, describe a time in your past where persistence led to the sale of a product. What specific actions did you take and what was the result? And for a situational question, maybe targeting an office position. Suppose it's an incredibly busy day, numerous clients are calling, demanding information, getting irritated by a slow response. Half the staff is out of the office. How would you deal with this? Me, I would panic. I would give a terrible answer because I'm already stressed out thinking about it, and I probably wouldn't get the job. But that's the key, right? We're targeting a specific reaction, a specific behavior in that scenario, and looking for a really powerful response. The important thing here is that we've already identified what a high performance behavior looks like. So in these cases, our questions can be targeted and relevant. Okay, hopefully we can have some fun with this one. Anyone who wants to participate, please feel free. You can type out your answer in the chat, and I'll read a few as they come up if we get any good ones. So in the interest of gaining a full perspective on question design, we would love to know, what's the worst question you've ever been asked in an interview? If you want to participate, take a few minutes. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and we'll see if anything fun comes through. Yep, we're already off. Oh, these are great. Okay. What basketball team do you cheer for? That's perfect. That's a great example. How does your husband feel about you exploring this position? Oh boy, that's great. Are you planning on having more children? Mm-hmm. Yep, that's not only bad, it also is borderline illegal in some cases. How many children do you have? Yep, how old are you? Love this one. If you were a dog, what dog would you be? What if your husband got a job in another state? Okay, I see a theme emerging here. What fruit would you be if you were a fruit? These are terrific. When do you plan on having a family? Mm-hmm. Oh, what does your age or generation say about your work ethic? These are great. Lots coming through about questions about kids and marriage. How old are your kids? What's the daycare situation? How many children do you have? Lots of questions about what your husband's doing, or are you married? This is very insightful. I would not have thought that this many have come through. Tell me a joke. That's really put someone on the spot with that one. These are great. Okay. I might read more of these if we have time at the end, because this is just great entertainment. What animal would you be? Yeah, these hypothetical ones these could be very strange. Are you currently pregnant? Really? Wow. These are terrific. So excellent examples. Thank you all. If I didn't read yours, trust me, I'm going to spend some time later going through all of them because these are terrific. But you can see a theme emerging here that of the ones that came through, not a single one was remotely related to anything that would be targeted on the job. It probably to this group, it seems intuitive and it makes a lot of sense that we want to avoid those types of questions. Unfortunately, as you can see from this ever-growing list of examples, that's not always the case in the real world. So we're hoping to maybe have some practical advice that we can take away from this, specific topics to avoid, how to target a question, what to ask about, that we can take back to our broader groups and hopefully create some good out there in the interviewing process. Thank you, everybody. That was amazing. Thank you for your participation in that. Some of your examples pointed to one or in some cases more of these pitfalls, but the fact is, even like these awful, unethical, sometimes illegal questions aside, there's some very innocent questions that serve to accidentally reveal non-job related information. So whenever possible, steer clear of things like hobbies, general interests, questions that have a subjective answer, really anything about a candidate's personal life, and material that doesn't relate to the job at hand. Because as an evaluator, once you hear that, it's really hard to unthink that information. It's just in there at that point. So these were all great. You can see here a list of some other things to avoid. I promised I had a good one for you. I really wish I was making this up. It sounds like some of you have had some similar experience, but here we go. Let's imagine you've received a phone call informing you your life story is going to be made into a Muppet movie. Which Muppet would you choose to play your character in the film, and why? I mean, wow. Now, I'll just note here, Beaker was not my answer. I just chose that image because it matched my reaction to the question. I do love Beaker, though. But I don't know. I think I said Fozzie Bear. Honestly, I was so thrown off. It's hard to remember. So happy that some of you have shared in a similar experience in the interviewing world. Okay, so now that we've had some fun, let's amp it up even more with a quick look at the evaluation component of structured interviewing. So I mentioned earlier that we like being able to have multiple interviewers. It's great. Now, the key is make sure the interviewers are the same for every candidate. If we can make that happen, you see some really positive effects. For one, this reduces the potential for either bias or personal preferences on the part of a single interviewer. Another point is that it improves the reliability of the evaluations. So all good things. It's also a really great idea to prepare interviewers with a little bit of training. I think what we have on here is a good baseline. So at the very least, interviewers should have a chance to review the questions ahead of time, obviously, to know which competencies are being assessed, to have some sort of familiarity with the rating scales being used. And it's super great if they have an awareness of at least some common sources of bias and rater error. Speaking of rating scales, the gold standard is the behaviorally anchored rating scale, or BARS. It's totally fine that when referring to a singular scale, it's still called a BARS. That doesn't bother me at all. But that aside, the goal here is consistency. So on this type of scale, we have a numerical rating, so 1 through 5 or 1 through 7. And critically, each point on the numerical scale is aligned with a specific description of the behavior. So hence the anchor. There's some real benefits to this method. So a major one being that evaluators are strongly encouraged to think about actual on-the-job behavior because they have to justify their rating based on their description. For some side benefits, anchored rating scales also serve to reduce the possibility of bias and error. Here's some fun examples. So halo effect. I'm sure you've experienced this where someone just gives a really outstanding answer for their first question, and then that unduly influences the following questions. The other two kind of go together, central tendency or leniency or strictness. That's just basically the pattern on the part of an evaluator where either every answer is a 3 out of 5 because everyone is average, or a tendency to be too strict, too harsh, or too lenient on responses. So using an actual rating scale where there's a behavioral description built into each point can help reduce some of these errors. I wanted to end this section just with a few more general tips for successful structured interviewing. So a big one is to set expectations. Let the candidate know what to expect. Say, hey, welcome. We're going to ask a predetermined set of questions. You'll have time to answer. Once we've made it through that part, you'll have a chance to ask any questions you have, just to kind of put the candidate at ease about the process. Taking notes, this is important. It helps later when recalling the candidates. It'll also have the beneficial side effect of helping justify your rating on each question with specific points from the candidate's response. Whenever possible, we want to evaluate the responses in real time. This one takes some practice because you're doing each question, each response, but ideally, you'll be scoring each question as it happens. This is the best way to ensure that the answers don't influence each other, or that you're not just relying on a general impression. When we're using multiple evaluators, this one's important too. We want them to submit their results independently before they compare. This helps reserve kind of the value of each individual evaluation and not have, one evaluator influenced by like a debriefing conversation they had right after, or, wanting to match more closely to another evaluator's responses. So that one's important. And here, as our cat friend is demonstrating, don't be afraid to do some self-reflection, right? So audit the process, figure out what works, measure the outcomes, think about what's important to the organization. How do we know that we're making successful hires? So some factors to think about, but hopefully this gives you kind of an introduction to what we mean by structured interviewing and a basic framework for how to do it. On that note, I'm very excited to turn things over to Matt, who will dive into the science and the research behind structured interviewing and why it works the way it does.
Thank you, Justin. Yeah, as Justin said, I'm going to talk about basically the research basis. So how do we actually know that structured interviewing is better than unstructured interviewing, and what are some of the reasons for that difference? So, one thing that people are often not aware of is just the sheer volume and amount of scientific research that is actually done on employment interviewing. One of the most recent academic papers on job interviewing that came out examined the results of 137 different studies involving over 10,000 interviewees. So there's a huge amount of research out there on how to conduct effective interviews. And these research studies, they all work in basically the same way. So a set of interviews is conducted with some level of structure, might be a lot of structure, might be not much structure at all. The interviewers rate the candidates on how good their answers were or how suitable they would be for the job. And then the job performance of those candidates is evaluated after they've started work, so usually by a supervisor or manager. And the researchers then look at, well, what was the correlation between the ratings provided by the interviewers and the candidate's performance on the job? So did the people who got low scores on the interview perform poorly on the job? And did the people who got high scores on the interview perform better on the job? And, critically, does that correlation change or depend on the level of structure that was there in the interviewing process? So do you get stronger correlations when there's more structure? And, what the research has shown is that, yes, interview ratings are predictive of subsequent performance on the job. And yes, interviews that use more structure are more predictive of performance on the job. So, I want to show you an example of a study that looked at how predictive, 92 different interview formats were. And, this was a meta-analysis. This combined the studies of a whole bunch of previous studies involving over 7,000 interviewees. So, in this study, to simplify the analysis, they categorized interviews according to how much structure they had in the questions. And so as you can see on the screen here, that ranged from, no structure at all, down at a number 1, all the way up to a really strict structured interviews where every single candidate got the exact same questions in the same order, and there were no candidate-specific follow-up questions or probing questions allowed. They also categorize the interviews based on how much structure there was in the rating scales. Again, ranging from a single sort of overall global evaluation, right up to having, separate bars. So those behaviorally anchored rating scales that Justin was talking about, for each individual question. So, what they did was basically they looked at, for each category of interview, how predictive they were of job performance. And they measured that using a correlation coefficient. So for a correlation coefficient, it ranges from 0 to 1. 0 means it's not predictive of job performance at all. You get no useful information on job performance. And 1 means you're predicting job performance perfectly, which never happens in real life, but 1 is as high as you can get. So starting down in the bottom left of structure, you're looking at interviews with really no structure at all. You can ask whatever questions you want. It's not set. It can differ between candidates, and you're just looking like a single overall global evaluation. And so the average kind of correlation between interview performance and job performance you're getting there is a correlation of 0.07. That's not 0, but it's a fairly low correlation. So at the next level of structure, what you've got is, some guidance on the questions that are asked. So, some questions are fixed, some overall guidance on, which competencies we're assessing, and, some level of structure to the rating scales. And just by adding this small degree of structure and consistency to the interview, you can see that the correlation you're getting is more than doubled. Okay, so adding that degree of structure boosts your predictive validity for the interview process. Now, moving up to the next level of structure, here you're starting to get some serious kind of structure, and the correlation nearly doubles again. So at this level of structure, what you've got are, well, we've got a fixed set of questions for every candidate. You must evaluate candidates against these structured rating scales, and there's some degree of restriction on candidate-specific follow-ups. So it might be you can only ask, a set number of follow-ups per candidate, and those follow-up questions might need to be on specific topics or simply asking for more details or something like that. Finally, you've got, the most structured interviews of all. So here, right at the top end, you've got, the exact same questions for every candidate, detailed behaviorally anchored rating scales that are separate for every question, and no follow-ups at all. So you can see your correlation goes up a little bit here, but you're starting to see diminishing returns once you get to this sort of very high level of structure. But the overall story here is, Justin went through in his presentation a number of different elements of structure, asking the same questions, making sure those questions are job relevant, using behaviorally anchored rating scales, using the same interviewer, limiting follow-ups, all of those kinds of things. And what the research is showing is that every time you add one of those structured elements, then your capacity to predict job performance from your interview ratings goes up a little bit. So, I think the research evidence here is really quite solid in terms of just the sheer number of studies that have been conducted demonstrating that more structured interviewing processes allow you to predict job performance better. So let's have a look at why. Why does adding structure work? And for me, there's really three things that come through, and Justin's already sort of laid the groundwork here. So the first is consistency in process, the job relevance of the questions, and the diligence in the judgment. So, let's look first at consistency. When you're comparing two candidates, you want it to be like this. You want to be able to clearly see exactly how suitable each candidate is in comparison to the others. Just like you can see, the comparison here really clearly between candidate A and candidate B. But when the context in which you see and evaluate candidate changes, it can be harder to directly compare those candidates. But you don't want to be in a situation like this, where the context in which you're viewing candidate A is different to the context in which you're viewing candidate B. You'll be able to see the differences and the similarities between candidates more clearly if the only thing that changes from interview to interview is the candidate. So changing the interview questions, the order of the questions, the interviewers, the standards you apply, what kind of banter you have before, what kind of banter you have after, all of those changes, affect the context in which you're viewing the candidate, and they make it harder to objectively compare candidates against one another. So consistency is one of your key evaluation points for a structured interviewing process. The next is job relevance, and job relevance is pretty straightforward. By concentrating only on job relevant questions, structured interviews give you more useful information for predicting job performance. And I guess for every little bit of non-relevant information that comes in, that's going to influence your judgment, sometimes in quite unconscious ways. And it's difficult, as Justin said, to unhear the job relevant information once it's come out. So the best approach is simply not to hear it at all. I have 3 tests that I apply to evaluate whether a question is job relevant or not. The first one I call the explain why test. Okay, one of the things about structured interviews is that the job relevance of the questions is obvious. It's immediately apparent that you're asking about knowledge, skills, abilities, scenarios that are relevant to the job. Okay, so sometimes interviewers don't like that obvious nature of structured interviews. They think that they need to kind of, sort of double think the interviewee or trick the interviewee by asking something unexpected. You'll probably just end up tricking yourself. When you get a question like that one you had, Justin, what Muppet are you? Or one of the ones that came up, it's like, what fruit would you be? One of the things that happens when a candidate gets that question is a million things flow through their mind. Okay, I don't know what Muppet I am. I don't know what fruit I am. They pluck one of those things that's coming through their mind and they blurt it out because they don't want to not answer the question. The issue is that if you ask that same candidate that question the next day, or, if they'd, had an extra coffee for breakfast or something like that, they could answer something completely different because they don't know. They're just grabbing the first thing that comes through their head. And so if you're not getting a consistent answer from the candidate, okay, then there's no way you're going to be able to draw consistent conclusions from them about how they would perform on the job. Justin, you were Fozzie Bear one day, you might have been Beaker the next day or a different Muppet the day after that. How can I get any reliable information about how you're going to perform on the job if which Muppet you are is different every day? Okay, so the explain why test is a really good test to ask. If you have to explain why the question is job relevant, it's probably not job relevant. My next question, or my next test, is the barbecue test. If you could ask that question at a social or family barbecue and not stand out, then it's probably not a job relevant questions. Job relevant questions really look like interview questions for a specific job. They're not get to know you stuff. They're not about hobbies or what you did at college or what your interests are or your sporting teams. They're about the job, and it's going to be weird if you ask them at a barbecue. So apply the barbecue test to determine whether a question is job relevant or not. And the final one is the no right answer test. If you're doing a structured evaluation of a candidate, there has to be an agreed right answer. If you've got your 2 or 3 interviewers, you're not going to get good information if all 3 of those interviewers or those raters have a different idea about what the right answer is. So, there's got to be one good right answer for a question. For it to be a good structured interview question. So you can see things like the Muppet question fail here, So those are my 3 tests that you can apply to your interview questions to determine, if they're job relevant or not. The last thing I'll bring up is, what I've called diligence in judgment. And so this is drawing here on the distinction between thinking fast and thinking slow that, Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel-winning psychologist and economist talks about. So fast or automatic thinking is instantaneous, it's effortless, and it's unconscious. It's always on and it's always going. It's the kind of thinking that instantly sums up a candidate based on how they look, how they walk, how they talk, and it's highly susceptible to biased and stereotypical thinking, okay? Thinking slow, or what I've called diligent thinking here, is deliberate, focused, and effortful. You kind of need to consciously engage this level of thinking because ultimately your brain doesn't really like it. It's expensive. It uses up a lot of glucose and a lot of oxygen to think in this, diligent, effortful kind of way. But research shows that it's less susceptible to things like bias based on, race, age, and gender. And it's the kind of thinking that's really going to help you in terms of that, often fairly complex comparison of a candidate's interview answer to a behavioral anchored rating scale or an agreed definition of a correct answer. The more you structure an interview, the more space you open up for this kind of detailed, diligent, slow thinking. A structured interview provides, if you like, the food that this kind of diligent thinking needs. And so what you want to be doing is getting that, consistent job relevant information to undertake that slow, careful, and diligent comparison of a candidate's answers to their interview responses. So basically some of the underlying research behind how effective structured interviews are and a little bit on why they are. So Justin, over to you to challenges and objections.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt. That was awesome. Really insightful information, and just goes to show that this is not all in vain, right? So undertaking this interviewing process it's supported by research. It's been, it's held up over and over again in research and academics. And, from a practical perspective too, we really see the benefits, working with customers specifically. So really great to see that. Okay. So now that we know that, I think as part of this discussion, it's important to acknowledge that there's some work that goes into structured interviewing, and there's some maybe points of resistance along the way. So with that in mind, we wanted to go over a few common objections, specifically from the perspective of hiring managers, and then provide some strategies, some practical takeaways for addressing each of those objections. So starting with the fact that it's impersonal. We hear this a lot. Some managers prefer a more casual and free-flowing conversation, and they find structure makes for an unpleasant interview. So to me, in addressing this objection, it's all about how you present the interview to candidates. Having a structured process doesn't have to feel robotic. There's room in there to introduce yourself, to talk about your organization, and to be welcoming with your tone and body language. I think I previewed this point earlier, but it also helps to explain how the interview works. So let the candidate know, you've developed a standardized process with the goal of allowing candidates to speak objectively to their specific job qualifications. We get some benefit out of that from bringing that to the forefront with candidates. And then finally, we've touched on this before, but in a structured interview, we don't want it to get personal, right? The more non-job related details we learn about a candidate, the more likely we are to be inappropriately influenced by one of those details, consciously or not, as Matt pointed out. So the objection to this is, yes, it is impersonal, a little bit intentionally so, but also there's things we can do so that it's not uncomfortably impersonal. Don't be afraid to use humor and empathy, be welcoming, absolutely show off the job and your organization as part of the introduction. And all those things can help put the candidate at ease. Here is a second common objection. So, I am doing the interviews myself because I'm trying to find a good culture fit for my team. I can't adhere to this process because I need to subjectively feel out whether or not someone's going to be a good fit. Well, my first instinct on this one is we can actually target specific traits and competencies by designing good interview questions. So, if what you mean by fit is that there's certain personality factors that tend to lead to success on the job, and that either from the research or from having measured it, then we can target those traits. We can build interview questions around behavioral competencies. So absolutely can do that. The only qualifier there is that we want to make sure the things we're assessing, again, are actually related to job performance. So as attractive as it might seem to only hire people that you subjectively think will be a good culture fit, we need to be very careful about that. Additionally, I would say that trying to select for types of people without any other theoretical or measurement kind of grounding can lead us down the road of bias and potentially work against DE&I efforts. So we just need to be careful with that. Along the same lines, we need to think about kind of how different cultures hear certain types of questions. So, an example would be let's say we're asking, what makes you the best fit for this job? There's unintentional considerations with that, with how comfortable people from different cultures might be when asked to essentially brag about themselves. We don't seem to have a particular problem with it in the States, but in certain parts of the world, that would be a difficult question to answer authentically. Just something to keep in mind, and another reason why standardization and objectivity are our friends here. I need to make the job more attractive. So listen, this one's legitimate. We've been in a period for a little while now where companies have really had to put their best foot forward in making themselves an attractive place to work. Definitely get that. And we actually don't want to discourage that. A lot of that is really positive, and there's been some good outcomes from it. But you can do it within the structured interview framework. So I mentioned before, being willing to share information about yourself and your organization. Some things this can include would be values, goals, anything else that you're proud of that the organization's doing. By all means, like, talk about why the candidate should want to be there. That's important. But with that, keep in mind that structure actually doesn't negatively impact how a candidate views the organization. In fact, we can even sometimes increase fairness perceptions by explaining the reasoning behind a standardized process. So there's a small startup named Google. You may have heard of them. They looked at this exact thing and found that candidates who had a structured interview were 35% happier with the process than those who did not. And this was among candidates that were rejected, but still serves our greater purpose here, that you're not losing anything from a perception standpoint by implementing structure. And again, candidates can absolutely be given time to have all their questions answered once the predetermined questions have been asked, answered, and evaluated. And you can let them know up front, like, we're going to go through this process, and then you'll have some time at the end to bring any of your questions to the forefront. So this one kind of appeals to hiring managers' ego. I know what a good hire looks like. This might be my favorite. So look, when Matt and I found out we'd be hosting this session, I knew I'd really need to bring some revolutionary content to the table. In psychology, we love a good diagram. So I spent many sleepless nights trying to come up with a theoretical framework for structured interviewing and why it works the way it does. So this lovely Venn diagram is the result of that work. What I want to highlight here, in all seriousness, is that managers still have the onus of the decision. That still rests with the hiring manager in most cases. The goal with interviewing and with structured interviewing specifically, and more broadly, really with any selection battery, whether it's interviews, assessments, job centers, anything else that we throw at candidates, it's to give those managers as much job-related, objective data as possible about a candidate to support their decision. So, we like to say, supplement your instincts with some science. We're not stripping the decision away from managers. We're not telling them who to hire. We're telling them what the objective data says about how likely it is that a candidate's going to be able to perform on the job. And if I'm a hiring manager, I definitely want that information in my pocket as I go to make my decision. And finally, this one is unavoidable, but there are concerns about the amount of work that goes into structured interviewing. Very legitimate. In fact, our own internal benchmark report turned up that the top 3 hurdles to structured interviewing in our poll were defining the evaluation rubric, defining the questions, and finding time to develop the entire process. So in one way or another, all 3 of these are related to the time and the effort that goes into the process. So how do we address that? The short answer is yes, it is. It is some work. You'll have to do a little bit more upfront than if you were just going to wing it in an unstructured interview. And I will qualify that by saying you have to do a little bit more upfront the first time. Because the longer and more complicated answer is that, as we're probably all personally aware on this call, recruiting is hard. It just is. Interviewing is time consuming, and turnover is very expensive. And in that context, the great news is that you really only have to do the hard work once for a structured interview. Those Google people measured this as well, and they found that once the process was established, Structured interviewers somehow saved interviewers 40 minutes per interview. So that is a really tangible result. And the reason for that is, for all the reasons we mentioned, you're focusing on job-related content. You already have the list of questions laid out. You have a strategy for evaluating the responses, and we're limiting all that ancillary information. So yes, it takes some effort, and absolutely I understand there's a lot of teams that we work with very few people trying to accomplish a lot of goals and projects. So I'm not casting any of that aside. And I know that, from an executive leadership perspective, interviewing is not always the biggest fire to put out. So with an understanding of all that, if there's time to build in to develop this process out as kind of a one-time solution, once that template's in place, you get great results and it saves you time in the long run. Okay. To conclude today, we wanted to look at a practical setting in which structured interviewing has been successful. And interestingly, one place we've found that success is with video interviewing. And some of the reasons will stand out, I think, as we go. So in this example, we're talking specifically about an asynchronous video interview. So one where the organization pre-records their questions, and then the candidate has the flexibility to go on and record their responses at whatever time is convenient for them. So you've probably picked up on this theme already, but there's a perception that structured interviewing can be difficult to enforce and maintain. By introducing video interviewing into the process, some of those components of structure are now built into the solution. So things like asking the same questions of all candidates, limiting small talk and non-job related information, even using an anchored rating scale. These are all things that you no longer have to account for when using a video interview platform. That's very cool. For some more specific context, I wanted to give a look at how one company is leveraging video interviewing to increase structure. So in this example, this was a fairly large media company hiring for a whole variety of different roles. Now, this part was actually fun. They started with a day in the life video, they called it. So to some of the points we've talked about, they were able to introduce the organization. They were able to give candidates an idea of what to expect and just kind of put them at ease to start the process. And then following that, candidates received a practice question, as well as throughout the interview, had the ability to re-record their responses. And really, this was all done in the name of creating a more comfortable and welcoming process, knowing that a one-way video interview, just on its own is not the most engaging and personal process to go through. They did all these great things to make it as much as possible feel like a face-to-face conversation. So all on the structure side, all candidates received the same questions in the same order. There was even an option to hide some personal information, like even the candidate's name, to further minimize bias. So we know now from a few different studies that even a candidate's name can impact whether or not they're progressed to the next stage of the recruitment process. It's unfortunate, but it is out there. And then finally, there was a 5-point rating scale built into the platform so that each question could be evaluated reliably. So overall, some really great features. Here is a little bit about what the company had to say about the process. So they loved that they could create a structured interview that was convenient for candidates. That's obviously very important in fostering positive candidate perceptions. They also found that they were able to focus on performance by eliminating as many unnecessary variables as possible. So this gave them a really focused approach to understand candidates' responses to job-related questions. And currently, so more good news, they are now mentioning the structured interview process in the actual job posting. So as just as a means to place the focus on objective job relevant information. And there's some great research research that from a candidate perspective, it can be beneficial for companies to call out the both the standardization and the flexibility of a video interview, as these are related to candidate perceptions of fairness as well as usability. So really, really encouraging results from this group. It's a way to do where a lot of those elements of structure are already there for you, built right into the platform. So a nice option and a good way to see, knowing how popular video interviewing is becoming, really since COVID, that it may have the unintentional effect of increasing the standardization of the interview process, which would be a really great outcome. Okay, unfortunately, we are coming to the end here. So I just wanted to reiterate a few major themes from today. Hopefully, we all agree at this point that structure has a positive influence on the psychometric properties of an interview, so validity, reliability. As Matt explained in a very compelling way, the benefits of structured interviewing are conveyed through an increase in consistency, a strict and targeted focus on job relevance, and by aiding the interviewer's diligence and judgment. From a practitioner side, I think we've seen why it's important to think about question design as well as the use of anchored rating scales. And hopefully we've demonstrated that although it does take some effort up front to design a structured interview, that the benefits are realized rather quickly. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening, and we're going to jump on and take some questions. I'll pull up the Q&A and see what we have going on there. Please feel free to submit. We have until the top of the hour, so we'll just grab any questions as they come in. Let's see what we have. All right. Oh, we do already have some. Great. Okay. First question. This was submitted by Ivana. Our company brings in salespeople for busy season. This year, we're doing all the interviewing online. Do you have tips on structured interviews when bringing in a high volume of people? Have you ever heard of companies doing group virtual interviews and being successful? That's a great question. I think the first point that comes to mind is actually what we just finished with, which is video interviewing. So in addition to those psychometric properties, video interviewing can really increase the efficiency and get the wheels in motion, particularly in a high volume setting. That's kind of exactly what it was designed for. Just because, even if it's replacing like a phone screen, the process of going back and forth and linking up schedules and trying to find a time to get every single candidate on the phone in a high volume setting can be very demanding. With video interview, you record the question once, you send it out to as many candidates as you like, and then they have the flexibility to respond. On the evaluator side, you have the flexibility to evaluate it on your own time. So that would probably be the main strategy that comes to mind. In terms of group interviews, I'm assuming that means like having multiple candidates on at the same time. It would be difficult to gain, I think, the same predictiveness and reliability out of those. I think the value in that would be more of like an orientation. So if you needed to bring in all the candidates on at once to do the explanation part, like, hey, this is what the job looks like, this is what you're going to be asked to do. If that doesn't work for anybody, feel free to not move forward in the process. I think that would be legitimate, but I think from a structured interview setting, it would be hard to do that in a group process. But really great question, though. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a great one. I think there's some research showing in those group interviews that the candidate who talks the most gets the highest ratings. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of it can be difficult to fairly evaluate every candidate in those kind of contexts. We got a question here from Jillian. What's the best way to build a personal connection with a candidate during a structured interview? I think it's a great question. I'm going to flip it to start with. So, we've got the interviewer here who wants to build a personal connection with the candidate. My question here is, what does the candidate want? Okay. And in particular, what is a high performing, what is a good candidate? What is a candidate with lots of relevant job skills and experience want to do during an interview. And you know what the good candidates want to do? They want to tell you about their job relevant skills and experience. That is their primary goal during the interview. So, a structured interview actually meets the goals of the candidate, okay, because they get the perfect opportunity to talk about their job relevant skills and experience. What does a bad candidate want to do? What does a candidate without job relevant skills and experience want to do? They 100% want to establish a personal connection in an interview. They want to be your best buddy. They want to talk about the hobbies and the shared experiences and the sporting teams and all that kind of stuff, because they know that if the interview moves on to job relevant skills and experience, they've got nothing in the bag. So, my kind of response here is that, building a personal connection might be your goal, and that's fine, but it's often not the goal of a high-performing candidate. They want to talk about their job relevant skills and experiences. Having said that, I think in the introduction, as Justin went into to the interview, when you're explaining it, you can certainly use that kind of positive and welcoming body language. The other thing that I've seen is after the interview is done, for a high-performing candidate, one of the things that you can do is say, okay, that, we've done the interview now. I'm going to hand you over to, one of our managers or one of our supervisors or whatever. They're going to take you on a tour of the office, that kind of thing, and kind of separate that component from the evaluative component of the interview. So, interviews today, they serve multiple goals. We want to sell the company. We also want to evaluate the candidate. Sometimes the best thing to do is actually to put a hard divider and a hard separation, between those two different goals so that they don't interfere with one another. Another question here from Felicia. So the question is, how do you ensure you're asking the right questions, and how do you discern what is considered a good versus a bad response? So this is where the work comes in. This is where the pre-work comes in. So how do you ensure you're asking the right questions? Well, you've basically got to go in and start talking to people who are incumbents, people who are on the job, people who are supervisors of people on the job, and you're asking that basic question: what does good performance look like? What are some of the scenarios that occur on this job that separate good performers from poor performers? Okay. What are the contexts in which good performers actually show themselves, and so on? And be like, okay, well, actually, we're a service technician, and when we get this kind of issue coming in, then that actually really distinguishes between, the good performers and the poor performers. So you build a question around that particular scenario. And when it comes to discerning a good versus a bad response, again, you're relying on your incumbents, on your SMEs, on your supervisors to say, what does a good response look like here?
Yeah, really great question though. And it does take some intentional thought, but I think you can see the positive results that we've spoken to. We had another good one come in from Gladys. So asking, we're looking for talent with basic office skills, but many of our applicants are lacking the necessary speed and accuracy, things like 10 key, data entry, words per minute. How do we tap into attracting talent with these basic skills rather than attracting applicants lacking these skills? I know Matt can do another entire hour on this, but I think in general, what we're looking at with some of these is probably using targeted assessments to try to key in on some of those skills. So rather than as your first step being, let's just collect a bunch of resumes and see who has the keywords that we're looking for, replacing that first step or at least very early on in the process with, hey, thanks for applying for this job. We want to give you a chance to show off some of your job related skills. Would you please click here? And then it takes them to, a 10 key assessment or words per minute assessment, Microsoft Office skills, so that they're not having to tell us on their resume that they know how to type or that they had to use Microsoft Office. They actually get to show us and we can measure it. So for me, using that up front, is going to kind of rule out some of the candidates who don't have those skills, but also it's going to bring in more candidates who probably would have been ignored because they had the wrong keywords in their resume, where they really do have the exact skills you're looking for. So I think that is probably the best way to target those types of specific skills. Looking at here. Oh, great question. So Jen sent in, how can structured interviews help with enhancing diversity? So there's a lot that goes into that. In general, I know we're coming up on time, but using rating scales and using structured interviewing in the manner that we've talked about, kind of the research has demonstrated that those methods are less biased against demographic subgroups, than unstructured interviews, which I think intuitively we can figure that out by now, but also less biased than a bunch of other methods that you would think about using. So in line with kind of the overcoming objections piece, like, why do we need to use structured interviews? I would ask, what would you replace them with? And the pitfalls there are that the things that you would replace them with are going to end up being less predictive and actually serve to increase bias against certain groups, where relying on those numerically anchored rating scales can give us a fairer chance for candidates from all backgrounds.
Yeah, great response there, Justin. I think some of the latest research that came out shows that, just looking at differences between, race differences between Black and white Americans, using a structured format cuts down bias by a third. So just some really strong evidence that that your bias is reduced simply by enforcing that structure. And it's interesting when you look at people wanting to reduce bias. There's a lot of things you can do. Do we do like diversity training, or do we do implicit bias training or something like that? Well, actually, one of the best things to do from a hiring perspective is actually to do structured interviewing training. Is probably going to have more of a direct effect than other forms of training. We got a couple of questions here from Joanne and Joyce on follow-up questions, which I always think is a really interesting topic. And does it veer away from structure, or can you ask follow-up questions? There's some really interesting research which basically says that the more follow-up questions you ask, the more kind of cueing you're giving to candidates about what a good answer is. And the candidates who are good at picking up on that will give better responses. I think some of the research shows that, restricting or limiting follow-up questions can be beneficial, but it's probably not something I'd get in a huge fight about with someone who was just introducing structured interviewing for the first time. I think we're about at the top of the hour now, aren't we, Justin?
Yeah, we're over by a couple minutes, but really great questions. Awesome participation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Rhonda, for having us here. And I think I was going to throw it back to you for some housekeeping to finish up here.
That's great. Thank you so much to both of you, Justin and Matthew. Excellent presentation. Very, very helpful. Lots of great comments coming in, people echoing that as well. And the folks at Criteria, thank you so much for sponsoring. And for those of you who joined here via Zoom webinar, your HRCI and your SHRM credit, those will be in your account within 2 business days. I guess within 2 days now. We'll send you an email with that information as well. This has also been recorded just now, and I'll have it archived shortly on HR.com. So those of you who are view a live stream, you can check it out on HR.com for the credits, or if anyone would like to view it again for the great information, then you can do that as well. And then one final note, very important, your feedback is important to us and the folks at Criteria. So just take a moment when it closes out the session, the exit survey is going to open in a new browser on your computer. So just take a moment to fill that out. All right, thanks again. Take care, everyone.